According to Dr. Hickson, quote, many German theologians were especially indignant that Pope Benedict criticized the sexual revolution of the 1960s, which they hold in high regard. Hello, is this mic on?
Beauty and goodness. It's Happy Hour with Matthew Arnold.
We're talking about this article that was written by Mikey Hickson, on the LifeSite News blog called Pope Benedict Reacts to Criticisms of His Letter on the Sex Abuse Crisis. And in that letter, I was telling you that he basically says that the way to address the abuse crisis in the church is to return to loving God and keeping the commandments. Golly, who'd have thunk, right? Love the Lord your God with your whole heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself, right? Now, how could this possibly be controversial? I mean, anybody who lived through the 1960s and 70s, and I was there, and anybody who has seen the horrific aftermath of the abandonment of Christian morality and the terrible cost in human misery that has followed it, to anyone who is a believing Catholic, this cannot possibly be controversial. And yet, according to Dr. Hickson, quote, many German theologians were especially indignant that Pope Benedict criticized the sexual revolution of the 1960s, which they hold in high regard. Hello, is this mic on? It's what Terry and Jesse always say. Is this mic on? Now, one of these critics is a history professor from Germany named Birgit Aschmann. And according to Dr. Aschmann, the sex abuse crisis was not caused by the sexual revolution, no, but the church's old-fashioned teaching on sexuality, especially Humanae Vitae. You cannot make this stuff up. She said, according to Dr. Aschmann, the church's, quote, restrictive doctrinal attitude is distant from real life, okay, unquote, and therefore rendered the church incapable of addressing the sexual needs of some of her priests in the right manner. So in her view, it was the lack of being able to speak about sexuality and the frustration about this fact that drew priests into, quote, seeking sexual contact with other men and women and also children. So in other words, this German professor, Dr. Aschmann, says because back in 1968, Pope Paul VI simply reiterated the Church's constant teaching that contraception and abortion and sex outside of marriage are mortally sinful. That's why there's a sex abuse crisis in the clergy. That's why there's a scandal. Well, why didn't I see it? Maybe because it's complete nonsense. You know, listen now. I'm a traditional Catholic. I have been critical of Humanae Vitae for a couple of reasons. Number one, because of the reversal of the ends of marriage in the document. Great. The ends of marriage traditionally are understood as the procreation and formation of children, and secondly, the good of the spouses. Okay, Humanae Vitae flipped that on its head. And that's more on that later. It's another talk for another time, really. The other thing was a lack of references to Scripture. Because there's certainly, Scripture has a lot to say about conjugal life. And I would have liked to have seen more of that in Humanae Vitae. But the point is, here, we're talking about the clergy. This woman seriously wants us to think that Humanae Vitae made sexual predators out of some members of the priesthood, which is the only segment of the Catholic population who are not affected by the document because they're, sworn to celibacy. You wonder why I've got high blood pressure. Like, I suspect it's not going to surprise you to learn that Ms. Aschmann is a member of the Central Committee of German Catholics, which, according to Dr. Hickman, is a prominent lay organization that militates for married clergy, women priests, and abandoning the Church's teaching on sexuality. Golly, you could knock me over with a feather. Now, Pope Benedict has responded to Dr. Aschmann's 4-page-long critique, and he points out that she doesn't mention God even once, which, of course, is the central point of his essay. And he quotes his own letter that she's criticizing to the effect that society in the West is forgetting God and thereby losing its measure for humanity. And he said, I'm quoting now, he says, as far as I can see, God does not appear in most of the reactions to my contribution. And with it, exactly that is not being discussed, which I had wanted to stress as the kernel of the question. In other words, they're completely missing the point or purposely ignoring it. The fact, he said, shows me the seriousness of a situation in which the word God often seems to stand at the margins, even in theology. How stark a contrast from the words of Christ in the gospel. You know, you can go to lifesitenews.com, click on blogs. It's under Mikey Hickson, M-A-I-K-E, Hickson. And I also saw another article that's kind of related. This one was actually published on Wednesday of this week over at thecatholicthing.org. And it's by Mary Eberstadt. It's called From Home Alone America to Primal Screams in 15 Years or Less. Now, Home Alone America and Primal Screams are names of books that were written by Ms. Eberstadt. And so this article is about her new book, which is called Primal Screams, How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. And this book argues that identity politics, which Mary Eberstadt actually identifies as the signature political movement of our time. Identity politics, she says, is rooted in the post-revolutionary erasure of the self brought on by the shrinkage and implosion of the family. And this is the family in the West, right? Although the contraceptive culture of death is being aggressively, exported to all corners of the world by the United Nations and the World Health Organization, among others. But while many, and I will say too many, conservatives tend to kind of just dismiss this identity politics business, Mary Eberstadt argues, I'm quoting now, she says, the anguish behind identity politics is real, but its foundation does not lie in abstractions like whiteness or patriarchy or the binary. She says what the timeline and other evidence shows instead is that identity politics cannot be understood apart from the familial dislocations and fractures endured by generations of people since the 1960s. Well, it sounds a little bit like what Pope Benedict was saying. And then she continues, divorce, cohabitation, fatherlessness, abortion, reduced family size, all of these phenomena have left post-revolutionary souls with fewer people to call our own. Fewer people who can be trusted to do what families are supposed to do. Have our backs, teach us, and love us no matter what. And that goes back to why I've been so critical of the reversal of the ends of marriage in Humanae Vitae, putting the good of the spouses before the family, before the procreation and education and formation of children, was clearly a slippery slope. And you can see the evidence. It's right before your eyes. When Humanae Vitae came out in 1968, there were 350 Catholic annulments. By 2002, there were 50,000 in a single year, right? 350 annulments in 1 year to over 50,000 in 1 year, right? In a space of, what is that? Not 40 years, 30 years. Back to Mary Eberstadt, she said, with the radical diminution of the family, right, the shrinking of the family, and its protections, has come an unexpected consequence. Humanity is ever more unsteady, ever less able to answer the question, who am I, as it always used to be answered before, relationally, with reference to one's place in the natural social order. Deprived of this elemental way of constructing reality, many people now flee ever more frantically to collective identities that are inferior simulacra for the real thing. Right? In other words, that people are rejecting their real families to embrace phony ones. And you note that these simulacra, it means imitations. These imitation families take various forms. Not everybody joins a street gang or gets involved in some ideological mob like Antifa, but lots of kids get involved with identity politics and the whole alphabet soup of homosexual and gender identities, primarily online. They encounter these virtual families precisely in their virtual world of the internet, which not surprisingly leaves them more alienated than ever. Now, I've often said we ignore the natural law at our own peril because nature has a way of balancing things out. Once upon a time, and there are still people alive who remember, once upon a time, young people wanted nothing more than to grow up and become a part of the adult world. And they sang the same traditional songs and danced the same traditional dances and, wearing the same traditional costumes worshiping the same God at the same liturgy and held the same values as their parents and grandparents before them. This is the natural order of things. And that's why American audiences, and we're talking about the most jaded audiences in the world, that's why they burst into tears and rise to their feet, when some young person on America's Got Talent sings an aria or plays a classical piece on the piano, because it stirs something deep inside of them. And the sting of this neglected beauty and this neglected connectedness to our own, traditions makes them weep.